Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Meta and Apex Legends competitive podcast. I'm your host, Burke, and today joining me is professional caster for the ALGS, Dia. And today we're discussing the preparation a team and a player can do before going into a match day, and the different ways that pros can study the game and their opponent in order to be successful at the highest level. So, Dia, thank you for joining me today.
It is my pleasure. As neither a coach nor a player, I am going to try and give my best insight here. But I do want to give the disclaimer that again, not a coach or a player. I do study the game a lot, and hopefully that'll be able to give some insight.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring you on for this because I do think that's an important encapsulation. I brought Zephyr on in the past, and one thing we talked about that I think didn't get, it still never gets highlighted enough is just how much work the casters put in behind the scenes to be as knowledgeable as you guys are about the game. Because at the end of the day, like, way more than almost every viewer, than even some players know about the game, because you're studying it from this outside perspective, and that's what you do. I mean, when you're not casting itself, you're or working on your individual like casting skills, you're working on your knowledge of the game, and I think that's why you're such a good person to bring on for this, because you get to highlight that knowledge and hopefully let that shine. Because I think, we don't have to talk too much about this, but one of the things that is hard is because, and Nice Wigs talked about this before, and I think it's important to highlight, is sometimes people can get this misconception that you don't know what you're talking about because there's a desynchronization between the observers and the casters, which is on neither of their faults, right? I mean, it's a hard dynamic to have two individuals coordinating like that, especially when you can't directly talk to them because you're currently casting. So
Mhm.
I think maybe that's where the miscommunication is, but there shouldn't be, because at the end of the day, I mean, I watch you guys cast and you're genuinely like saying very intelligent things consistently. And to be able to do that consistently on a main stage in front of, thousands, tens of thousands of people is really impressive. So, seriously, kudos to you for doing that. And I think that's why you're a perfect person to bring on for this today. Um,
That is very sweet. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, before going into the actual topic, for I think many people watching you and listening, they'll already recognize you. But for those that don't, could you just dive a little bit into the work that you do for the ALGS?
Yeah, so I'm a commentator. I'm part of the talent team for the ALGS. What this means is that during the regular season or during the Pro League regular split, I'm part of the team that covers North America and EMEA Pro Leagues. And then when it comes around to LAN, for at least the past three LANs now, I have attended and commentated and been on the analyst desk for those matches. So if you watch the mainstream over at twitch.tv/playapex, that's where you will have seen my face. I am not on there all of the time, but I am part of the rotating group of people that come through and work together to catch the game at a professional level.
Awesome. And I think I've had this question. I'm sure people have this question before. Is how did you get started in casting for the LGS? Because I think there's a lot of people that uh, really like that kind of work, and I've always been curious like how to get started in that. But also, like, did it manifest as an interest for Apex or as an interest for esport or like casting as a whole first?
It was a little bit of both. I was actually really interested in casting Apex before I ever got into casting, period. But at the time that I started casting, there wasn't really a third party scene for Apex Legends. I think it was just as they were starting to do like the winter circuits and things like that. And so it was in the first year of the ALGS or so, and you would have streams like I saw Rain Day and Girl and Hodzik cast,
Right.
and I remember like when Glitter and Bravo were doing GLL and things like that. But it wasn't like those are all very much household names, and so there wasn't a lot of like tier two scene like ways that you could get into casting Apex. So I started off in League of Legends, and that was, but not my second choice either. Like this was another game that I was really familiar with, and I ground through that sort of like tier three scene, moved into the tier two scene. Ended up like being on Academy for those of you who are familiar with League of Legends for a while. I do their Brazilian professional league now, or I manage that broadcast, and at around that time a couple tier or like a tier two third party is the word that we use. Tournaments started cropping up in Apex Legends, and I basically got to take all my experience learning how to talk on camera, how to present player storylines, things like that, and go to Apex broadcasts and say, hey, these are all the skills that I have. I would like to try on your, $50 tournaments, your $100 tournaments, things like that. Did that for a while, got into bigger broadcasts, applied to the challenger circuit, ground my way through that. A lot of it was like helping tournament organizers put on tournaments. So somebody would go, I want to put on a 10K. And I'd go, I want to help you. I'm going to cast. I'm going to organize whatever I can.
Right.
Volunteering as much of my time as possible. And then I mentioned this just a few days ago as well, but like what the movement from challenger circuits to the ALGS is really just you get an email one day and it's like, do you want to be in the ALGS? You're like, well, of course I do. So,
Yeah.
uh,
We're gonna say no.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Sorry, yeah. I've maintained my involvement with challenger circuit and third party tournaments because like I love Apex as a whole,
Right.
but I do mostly focus on Pro League.
Awesome. And so today specifically we're talking about the preparation that you can do outside of the game to be able to improve. And I think uh the work that you do has a lot of overlap for what
Yes.
players and coaches and teams just in general can do to improve before their match days. So, like before we dive into the specifics, could you just explain a little bit about the preparation that you take before ALGS, whether before the season or before the actual match days?
Yes, I think there's an important thing that I want to highlight here when we're talking about the difference between how I'll approach something and how a player or a coach might. And that is that I watch teams and I study and I prepare for games or tournaments by figuring out what it is that I can observe, I like what I can take note of that will lead me to tell a better, more cohesive story over the course of a broadcast while giving strategic insight.
Right.
Whereas a coach or a player will watch a team or they'll prepare for a match day by going, how can I beat them? And I'm not interested, for example, when I'm watching the VODs of NRG in how I would beat them. I'm interested in
Right.
what mistakes they're making, how other teams are beating them, if there are patterns evolving there, but I'm not interested in trying to dismantle what they've got going on. And so I think there's like a different goal going into those things. But my typical preparation does involve just watching a lot of VODs and taking note of patterns from teams, and then ultimately because it comes from a casting perspective, categorizing those patterns into different like archetypal behavior for each team or player.
Okay. And so I think that is a really important caveat. And I do have one question before we dive into this specific subject is at what point did you study Newcastle? Because I have a very distinct memory of dying to you in ranked when you were playing a Newcastle, and it was scarring for me because you had a
Oh my
Newcastle.
god.
It's in Thermal Station. I don't know if you'd remember this specific game. You were playing Pathfinder Newcastle. You're sitting right at top Thermal Station God height, and I'm sitting at end zone. Just took a fight to make top two, and you just take a zip across to this little pillar right next to the circle building, and you're
I
just
know the
sitting
game
there,
you're
and you
talking
just pop
about.
a Newcastle wall, and I'm just like, well, what can I do with that? I'm playing like Bangalore Ballistic or something. I'm just like, guess we'll just sit and die here. And so that
I
was us.
can't
So it's
believe that
very
was
funny.
you.
Yeah.
And
So
there was another team like by scaffolding, right?
yeah, yeah. And we
Oh
took
my
yeah. So
god.
it's so funny. I'm like, because I died, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's Dia. Dia killed me. I was like, I Newcastle too, of course. It's
That's
it's
so
very
crazy
funny. Yeah.
that that happened. Oh my
I was
god.
like, if I ever have him on an interview, I have to tell him that. So
I love that. I really like Newcastle. So like my favorite legends are like the wall legends, the ones that
yeah,
create cover, like Newcastle and Rampart. So
right.
whenever I'm not playing Rampart, I'm gonna play a bit of Newcastle. I
Yeah.
am glad that we got to run into each other. We should play together. It'd be
I
fun.
would definitely be down. I'm also trying to stream more, so maybe we can hit a rank stream or something. That'd be fun.
So,
So anyway, yes. What exactly was the preparation? What is the preparation that you do going into a match day or into the regular season that you think could be applicable or help teams that are looking to improve?
I think that probably the things that have the most carryover are um watching VODs uh for different teams, especially with POI draft, and like different teams that play out of the same POI is really interesting to watch. And for those of you who may not have heard of it, there's a site called DGS, and you can also Google ALGS stats, and it'll bring
Hmm.
up sort of the statistics from the recent Pro League. But looking at people who are around your level of play in Pro League cases, just the Pro League stats, who are like having success and what paths or loot paths they're having success with. I also find a lot of benefit in listening to team comms, whether that is teams, if you're a player or a coach that you are studying to just know more about, or to actually beat. You want to know their tendencies.
Right.
I remember one of the things that really stood out to me as being particularly helpful um, in this most recent match day that I casted was listening to Falcons comms
Right.
for a few games, and then listening to Weave comms for a few games because they were rotating right next to each other. It was Falcons rotating out of Launchpad, and Weave rotating out of Devastated Coast. And the way that those two teams would either like talk about or think about each other or not, because they were talking about each other
Right.
throughout a lot of these games, um, provided some really valuable insight that we were then able to use on broadcast. And I imagine if you are, say, Falcons or Weave, and you're listening to how another team is talking about you and thinking about the problems that you could present, it gives you a lot more valuable of a way to sort of like exploit what they're thinking about versus not.
Interesting. W- the thing that you said that really stuck out to me was is learning how teams are like around you are also talking about you, right? I mean, because
Yes.
at the end of the day, and all the different things we'll touch on, one of the big things is really just focusing on how to play around your opponents, because a lot of these players are studying each other as well, both playing the same POI as them to learn, well, what are they doing better that I could improve on, or
Mhm.
also studying, well, what are my neighbors doing that I have to worry about or that I can plan around to make my own advantage, right? I mean, if I know that, Launchpad never does back prowlers, well, then when it's this team, then I know that I can do back prowlers there, which didn't work for me when I played in CC scrims, but maybe it'll work for a pro league team that actually knows what they're doing. But I mean the big thing is there's a lot of different ways you can plan around other teams, and I like that you noted that, because that is something that anyone can do. The question I would ask is, if you were because obviously the big takeaway from these videos, I want people to be able to walk away, whether they're a pro league team or a coach or a player that's in CC or just trying to get better at ranked, something that everyone can take away. What would you say? How would you study an opponent like that? Or how can you apply that skill if you are not aware of who your opponents are, right? If you're in ranked or in CC, you know the name of the player if you're at CC, but you don't know how they play. You don't have VODs to watch. You just got, seated with them just now. How do you study an opponent that you don't know the name of?
I'm going to step back for a second, then answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at starting from like pubs and going to ALGS World Championship Finals
Right.
play, there is a level of like RNG that gets reduced.
Okay.
So if you're in pubs, you have very little control over anybody that lands around you, and you know very little about anyone that lands around. If let's say we're landing on, I don't know why my mind is on Kings Canyon. We'll shift over to World's Edge, right? Let's say I'm landing Fragment and I see a team landing Monument. If you're in Challenger, you have an idea of how they're going to loot that because there's a generally accepted way to loot Monument.
Right.
Um, but if you're in your ranked games, they might just all land triple height and then walk towards you. Like you don't know. There's a level of RNG that gets introduced at every level or gets
Right.
reduced at every level. And so what's most important is that you sort of identify what level you're at, like how much control you have over lobbies. The difference between like ranked and challenger circuit round one um, is going to be a pretty short distance to cover in terms of like how much you control.
Yeah.
But teams will be playing in a very different way. And so when you don't know who's standing next to you, it's more important that you rely on your inherent knowledge of the game, uh, outside of what a team is doing, like whether they're landing triple height at Monument or not. Let's say you as the team in Fragment know, okay, well, they can cross the bridge, they can cross the little platform leading
Right.
over to the crane, and those are the two areas that we need to watch, and we can control those areas from this position. So you want to have somebody playing a position and overlooking those areas just to mitigate risk. It's
Right.
either that or rotate out early, but like you have to know what the options you can control are that will put you in a better position to fight a team who is a little bit random and who might make a suboptimal decision by choosing to fight you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note there because the unpredictability that
Mhm.
exists at the lower levels that kind of gets mitigated further up. Because even in CC, I mean, there is this level, especially in like round one, where a lot of teams that are even really good struggle because of the unpredictability of some of their opponents. Where it's like, yeah, I should have gotten Godspot, but I spent 3 minutes fighting trying to hold off this team that was sending me for no reason, or something like that. Like my rotate was thrown off, or all these things. And even if you're better at fighting, it could still mess up some of your broader plans. And I think understanding what amount of RNG that you have in that regard is important. Like in ranked, that's a great example of where like I know, okay, um, maybe I'm landing at this one POI for consistency because that's a POI that I like. It's also a POI that relatively low amount of teams land at. I know the rotates pretty well. I like the loot. And so maybe you do land at this place consistently, but the reality of the fact is you have to still account for this other team could still land here. How do I approach that? What if, I'm landing Overlook and suddenly three teams land Climatizer? And how do I account for that? Because now I could have a team that's running away from the fight coming up the hill or something like that. And that is something that, as we're discussing all of these different things and how you can study the game, it's important to come aware of the RNG that comes in with each level. So I think it's a good discussion there. So, kind of moving from that on, what would you say? So I've said it before because I want to move into studying the game first because I think there's three different facets of this. There's studying the game, there's studying the opponent, and then there's preparing for the game. And so one of the things that I've heard said before is that, and this is for like a lot of players, but Zero is the most notable, is that Zero is a student of the game, and
Mhm.
I've heard a lot of people call him that, and this is something that separates the likes of like a Zero from a lot of other top tier talent. What do you think makes someone a student of the game, and how does that give you a leg up versus being someone who just plays the game a lot to improve?
Being a student of the game is, to me, encapsulated by understanding what other teams should, basically how the game should play out in a like computer simulation scenario. This is something that I really like about Zero that I try and emulate in our casting as well, is to look at a position and go, it all things being equal here, these two teams should fight each other, these two teams should fight each other. This rock is going to be in for a weird amount of time and have cover from the most important team.
Right.
One of the comms that is my favorite when he gives it, and he gives it pretty rarely, but sometimes you'll be watching Zero and he will look at the mini map or at the terrain in front of him and he'll go, this position wins the game. And more often than not, he's right. And calls like that are what separate like people who are students of the game, people who understand what needs to happen, versus people who, like you said, play the game a lot to improve. Because playing the game a lot to improve can give you some game sense, um, but it is more geared towards how do I win a fight? How do I get out of this alive? And studying the game is more about understanding how to manipulate, not even necessarily how to manipulate, but understanding the conditions that would lead any team to win. And so if you're playing on low ground and you get second or third place, totally fine, totally acceptable, and you can be a very good player and do that.
Right.
the difference between somebody who does that and somebody who does that and is a student of the game versus somebody who's not is the understanding of why that happened and the intentional choice to allow themselves to like get second or third place because it's the best choice because whatever happened. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I think to step into this for
Hmm.
people to be able to segment it out, because I mean, like I said, like this is something I want people to be able to reference back and kind of and take it piece by piece. And so like if you are watching this back, it'll be chaptered so that you're able to do that. And it's something I'm trying to do moving forward, because I realize that the biggest benefit of having people like you on is being able to parse this out into helpful segments that people can revisit to be able to learn from, because I think there's a lot of value that we're providing for people. So for someone listening at home, I think that you could approach this as, you know, studying the game as the school, right? And
Hmm.
if you looked at it that way, you could break down the segments that you'd learn about the game into subjects. So
Hmm.
I'll give you some of mine, but I'd be curious to break this down and basically be like, here are the different subjects that you can learn about Apex to improve if you're trying
Hmm.
to look at it from a scholarly perspective of the game rather than just a player of the game. So I'll give you my examples and let me know if I
Please.
missed any, if you'd reframe them differently or something like that. Ultimately, I think we can, after that, maybe dive into each one a little bit to kind of extrapolate what exactly um, about those subjects you could be focusing on. So I have them right here, just listed as macro, micro, map knowledge, which I do think is distinctly different than macro, and I'll get into that a little bit. Weapons, movement, legends, and game updates, which is I think one that like is the most obviously ever evolving of them. But do you think you agree with those subjects? How would you reframe them? Any you'd add?
I would put map knowledge and macro into the same
Okay.
bucket in large part. I would also put weapons and macro into the same bucket. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
and we can touch on that a little
Yeah.
bit later. Um, and then I would break micro up into like how to team fight, how
Okay, so
to
like
like
fights.
yeah, um, and then I would put player psychology in here somewhere, and I would put fight tempo in there. Because fight tempo, I think, is a really important. Like fight tempo and player psychology are important parts of micro, but I think that they're both diverse and important enough to a FICO or to a micro situation that I think you can like reasonably say that they're
Yeah.
top in themselves. I like the legends thing. I like the game updates thing. Um, I think we can either group POI knowledge into macro or leave it as its own separate thing.
Right.
But those would be the only
Okay.
additions.
So I
Yeah.
think we can approach them then. Let's kind of just dive into each one individually, and then if we need to
Yeah.
parse it out differently, we can. And again, if you're referencing this, it'll be chaptered down below, so you can kind of reference it there. And so let's just start with macro, and then we can see if we differentiate these. But the biggest aspect of macro that I think to touch on first is just rotations, right? I think that's what people look at when they think
Hmm.
rotations. You think of the pacing of the game. You have the initial drop with the loot pathing and your rotation timing. So like when are you leaving the POI? Those are two things that I think people need to be looking at um, as well. And in terms of like preparing or like studying the game ahead of time, an easy way to do that an easy way to improve on any of this is just, you know, VOD reviewing teams that do it better than you. And that can be in Pro League, you know, even in Pro League, there's room to say, I would say, unless you're like one or two teams in some situations, there's always one other team that's doing something better than you. Even at the best, even the best of the best teams, maybe not Falcons for some things because they are just killing it across the board. But even them, they could look at someone maybe like in a different region, or there's always something they can improve, and that's the reason you see Zero constantly VOD reviewing, is because he knows that there's always something that he can improve on. There's always something he can learn from other teams. Um, but from that, right, I think it's important that you are studying what are the, like, what's the time to loot out of this POI, what is the correct areas to loot. Where's the loot density at in this POI? And is this a good POI for me? I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but the POI draft at the highest level is something that requires a lot of understanding and studying the game to be successful in.
The POI draft, like you're talking about, is something that you can, on paper, win, but need more external things than just having a good POI in order to succeed.
There are other factors in play that now you need to consider. Like, it's not just enough, I think, maybe anymore to get the POI you want, but now you need to study the game to know, okay, you know, what happens when a POI is taken that from a team that doesn't know how to play it. I mean, that's a factor, right? Like, because the fact is, like, not every team has a coach, or not every team has a coach that's full time that can build all these strats out for you. And we've seen where there are decent teams that are playing POIs just not optimally. The RNG for the decisions people can make out of each POI became larger when the POI draft was initiated, because now we have teams that are not used to playing POIs, especially a place like Geyser, where, like, if you're a good team and you got stuck with Geyser, you're like, I've never played Geyser in my life. I don't know how to play out of Geyser because I'm the team that always forced other teams to go to Geyser. And so I am curious how much of that plays an impact. And I think that's where map knowledge comes in, and like rotations as a whole comes in, because you do have to have those plans to be able to account for wild card teams, especially obviously in ranked, but in CC as well. I think that's something that can apply. Moving kind of forward into macro, what would be the big staples that the subject matter of macro that you think is important to study as a student of the game?
For macro, I would focus on, and this does depend on your level of play, but what are the timings that you can reach certain positions that other teams then can't contest, or that they notably can. A big example, or probably the best example of this, is Command Center.
Right.
Um, your macro knowledge needs to be pretty good for Command Center, because you need to understand, for a POI that can reach most places in zone very quickly,
Yeah.
what are the other POIs that can do that, and what spots are they likely to take? If you're predicting a zone end, and I would actually stick that into macro as well. Is that understanding how zones work and where they're likely to end should be part of your macro study. So understanding those two things are probably the biggest elements of it. And then outside of that, I'd sort of like start moving map knowledge into it as well. Of, well, we are rotating to this specific place that we know is safe with the other teams that we think have done this, how are we going to do that in a way that actually keeps other teams from being able to interfere with us super easily? Great example is Kings Canyon, weirdly enough. A team that just dips straight through the center of Kings Canyon probably isn't using their map knowledge very much, because that is where you were at the biggest disadvantage. And
Right.
we have similar, but not exactly the same, examples play out throughout the rest of our maps. Thinking about World's Edge, for example, if you run straight from No Name up to Epicenter, there's this huge valley that you're in that, if you can't avoid it, you'll see a lot of teams move over through Overlook instead, because it's just much safer.
That's yes. So I really like your command center example, because I actually just recently interviewed Trev Stacks, and
Hmm.
first player interview, great, absolutely awesome guy, and someone that I think is one of the more underrated players in North America. And if you've ever watched him with a Sentinel, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That guy goes crazy. Um, he talks about their POIs, and he's basically like, if we get our POIs and we get a ring console, we're good. Like, we're gonna do well. And I actually talked to him after, I think it was last match day, and he was like, we got, he had bad RNG. They got no ring. They got like maybe one or two ring consoles on the day, and
Hmm.
they didn't put out any good performance. Uh, but that's a team where they land command center and they know their POI, and so they've studied the macro so much to where he's like, listen, me and Cap, we both know our rings. We both study the rings a lot. And so like the odds of both of us getting a bad zone call is pretty rare if we get ring console. So like that's something where they know their POI, they know the rotation so well that that's a team you'll see an end zone. You will see an end zone if they have the opportunity. Uh and that's a big value. And the other part of macro that comes into that is, well, what happens if I don't get the ring console? What happens if I don't get this information? What happens if I get this rotation utility where now I can go somewhere faster? And I think that's where studying the game is okay, I'm gonna land this POI, whether you're in ranked comp, whatever, CC, who is doing it like this? How do I replicate that? If they're successful, how do I need to play different if this isn't the way that I'm supposed to play? And one of the big things you talked about was studying the rotations from your POI. And one of the biggest things that I've talked about before is your priority. What are the POIs that I can get to? And if I have a ring console, what are the POIs that I can get to before other teams? Right.
Yeah.
Whether it's because I'm right next to the POI, whether it's because I'm in command center and I could just Valcult over everyone in between, whether it's because there is a team between us, but they don't have a ring console, so I can just go past them. There's a lot of different elements of that, and studying those is very important, and it can inform which POIs you select, because if you have a play style, I mean, this is another aspect of it, right? Is your play style can inform your macro, but you also have to make a decision of where you're playing that suits the play style you're going for. Like if you can either choose to adapt to the POI, or you can choose to pick a POI that adapts to your play style. And I think that that's where some teams can struggle, especially in the POI draft, is like I picked a POI that I'm not used to playing that way. And some POIs, like, I've heard it said that you can play, out of every POI, so like in any way, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, maybe you'd agree. I'm not sure, but like I certainly, if I'm landing landslide, I'm not playing edge, and certainly if I'm landing Cenote Cave, I'm not playing zone. Cenote, I don't know. I call
I,
it.
I think it's technically cenote, but I get the cenote thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
hard when you've never heard it. So it's like, but anyway, yeah. I mean, what would you have to say to that? Do you think that, um, when you're studying the game, do you think for selecting a POI that your team wants to play out of, how
Mhm.
much of it is a factor of your play style, and how much of it should be a factor of this is just a better POI? Because I mean, especially in ranked or CC, you sometimes don't have as much of a say. And maybe this is even true in Pro League. You don't have as much of a say in which POI you're necessarily going to get. You can get one that's similar, or you can get one that's better. Do you think that there's a better
Mhm.
answer to that?
I think in ranked it really doesn't matter at all, honestly. Like when you're picking for a POI that's your playstyle, because in ranked you don't really get to decide your playstyle. The lobby decides your playstyle for you.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately.
you just you have less control over it, and part of the magic is adapting to that. But when you're thinking about moving into pro play and things like that, I think it's much better to pick a POI that fits your playstyle rather than a better one, mostly because of the Evo changes. Um,
Right.
I think that Evo changes enable a lot of players to have better odds at actually taking a game win with any play style as long as they're actively participating in the game. However, I'm going to put a caveat on this that if you are landing somewhere because of your play style at a pro level, you also need to be picking legends around that style. Um, Zone teams are like super useful to think about here. If you're running Bang Blood Horizon and you're landing Landslide, it's not that you can't win a game, but you're just not doing yourself any favors. And
Right.
I think that you do need to be doing yourself the most favors possible when you're playing at the highest level.
Yeah, I think if you're playing that comp, you're the equivalent of like the Anteater's defense stance the whole game, just like hands up, ready to fight anybody that comes in. If you
Yeah.
don't have a ring console, I don't know what you have a controller legend. That's pretty much all you can do. So to kind of summarize macro,
Mm.
If I'm understanding correctly, the way I would accurately describe macro and what you can be learning for somebody that's at home listening, you can you can learn your rotations, right? Your timing, your loot pathing, your rotations of specific areas. You know, if the zone pulls this way and we think it's pulling to this POI, we're going to rotate this direction, and having plans for each of those zone pulls, right? What happens if it pulls close? Do we leave earlier than we normally would have left? If it leaves later, do we delay? Do we play for Evo?
Mhm.
And this comes into the planning aspect, because I'm going to talk about each of these subjects and kind of what you can actually tangibly, write down, what you can tangibly um, put onto paper to be able to practice. And I think that comes down to, you should be writing out your priority, right? What if I'm going to land here? If I'm going to land in, let's give a specific example, in landslide, right? If I have the ability, and if you want more on prio, you can check out, I think it's my pinned video on the Ring console. I talk a little bit more about prio specifically, but you can, if you have priority to a position, how does that affect my timing? You need to be writing like, we're leaving at this X time every time. And you can study that rotation just by landing even in pubs. Land there when no one's landing. I guarantee no one's landing in landslides in pub. But anyway, you can land in landslide, when are we leaving? Okay, this is how long it takes to loot. This is how long it takes to leave. Watch other teams do that, right? And then in terms of your rotations, you need to be calling out like, what are we doing with Evo and stuff like that. We talk about communication with Balverine and like how you could be calming that stuff, but and if you need to write that down, that also helps. But anything else that you would write in terms of, or like that you would put onto paper, or just like physically plan in terms of improving your macro, so that you can, going into a game, feel like you're prepared to handle the macro aspect of your game.
What I've heard you talk about is I wrote it down.
Yeah, you're good.
What I've heard you talk about is that you need to understand your rotations,
Yep.
how zone pulls affect you, your timing, and like how you wanna do that, and the pathing that you'll take to get there.
Right.
I would add in that you need to understand some level of those things for the teams immediately surrounding you. I
Right.
think that's one of the most important parts of macro that I would not feel comfortable going into a game of Pro League
Yeah.
without understanding.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. And that's where it comes into, especially in Pro League, like but in Challenger Circuit, it's the same, because in a way you're kind of drafting your POIs, because when you enter, if you've been in CC before, you enter, and then there's just everyone's in the chat basically drafting their POIs, saying, "Hey, I'm landing here, don't go here." And
Hmm.
it's a little bit more of an ego draft, but it's still a draft in some way. And so factoring that in and being like, okay, well, these teams are landing here. And correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think in CC, if you play with your 20 teams, the 10 that move on, you stay with, do you not? I'm not sure how true that is, but obviously, like, if you are playing in CC, you will see teams again, and taking note of, this is something that they did that was unique. This is a comp that they're playing that's unique, or this is, this is how they rotate a little bit different. Those are things that you can just, you could jot down in between games and be like, hey, we landed next to this team. We were in thermal and they were in tree, and for some reason they counter rotated to us in thermal to pick up Evo and stuff. So if we get this team again, this is something we can plan for, and stuff like that. Obviously, in Pro League, it's easier because you know who these teams are by name,
Mhm.
and you know their strategies. But even in CC, you can try to replicate that. I mean, in ranked, it's again like we said, you're kind of at the mercy of the teams, but you can still plan for it. You could be like, if a team does come from tree and we landed thermal, then do we can decide. I have it written down that we, instead of going right, we go left. Maybe we counter rotate ourselves and try to take advantage of something. There's ways you can plan around it, but the point being, you would say rotations are something you can write down, zone pools, and pathing, and just to kind of add on to that, a big way that you can do this to prepare is to go to apexlegendsstatus.com. Very, very valuable resource. It has where every weapon spawn is in the game, the gun racks. It has where, I don't know if they added like where Evo caches can spawn, or if that's something that is actually like
That
has
is not
been for.
available through the API.
Yeah, okay. So we haven't gotten that yet. So But you can get where the ring console spawn, where the survey beacon spawn, and then they even have a ring guesser game on there where you can actually practice zone reading. And having all of that together can really help you build out a good idea of how to work on your macro and develop your macro, because ultimately all of that informs the decisions you make when you come into the game, and the more of that you can put to paper, the more of that you're going to be able to apply. That's just definitely something like I built for my scrims. I built built loot pathing and possible rotations, the buildings in end zone I'd like to play if I could get to them, based on priority and stuff. And that's the kind of stuff that comes that you don't have to, like, it can come with time, and you'll build that in your head, but writing it down can help tremendously in the beginning when you're trying to like learn those things slowly over time. And absolutely all of that is a factor. The one last part of macro that we want to talk about was map knowledge itself. And the reason I didn't necessarily put it in
Sure.
macro is because one way to study the game, and this is so funny to me because you see it even in Pro League if you're listening to comms, there's always a situation where someone's like, "Oh, I know this, rat spot. You'll play there and like you can rat for an extra 4 placement." Or the best example that Jayhawk pulled out was during his Optic video was the 100 Thieves spot right outside of Launchpad, where he's like, "Oh, let's do the 100 Thieves spot." And it's like they had never played it before, but Drop just knows so much about the map that he's like, "I know that if we hit an evac behind these trees, we can land in between these rocks, and even though no one really knows how playable that is, it has a lot of cover that you just kind of know because you spent time studying the map." And
Mhm.
and knowing the map will help you avoid a lot of bad situations. Like, I still see more teams playing trucks than the trucks in World's Edge than I think should. And I don't think it's necessarily a map knowledge thing, but like sometimes it is. Like, I know, like, in this zone maybe the truck is good, but in this zone maybe the truck is bad. And it all comes down to, like, do I know the angles of any given position? Do I know how much cover somewhere actually has versus what it looks like? Some places look good on paper, and then you go to play there and you realize, well, this guy has a crazy head glitch on me over here. This guy has a crazy, head glitch on me over here, and maybe that's not as playable as I thought. Do you think that's something that is? I think one critique you might get from that is that it maybe is not a feasible thing to study. Do you think that's something that's worth putting your time into?
Yes. Yes. And like this game is not like mixture of me wanting to bring up other specific game examples and not wanting to plug other games, but like for the sake of doing it, the game isn't like Valorant where you can
Right.
just like open Valorant and sit in a map. I don't know what Valorant is like. I know that you have to stand still when you shoot, but like you can sit in a map, you can look at the map and you can go, these are all the places. Like every game of Apex, every ring of Apex changes, and so time, like even players that have been playing professionally since I started watching still learn new things about the game because you're always in different situations. And so I don't think that time should ever be a limiting variable for whether something is worth studying in Apex, because time is literally limiting everybody.
Right.
You're just not going to be in the same place in the same situation all the time. And so I I would say, like, just because you can't learn it all in one day or all in a couple hours or even all in a year, doesn't mean that it's not going to have a lot of impact when you are able to really study it on your success in competitive games.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because I mean, and kind of to kind of top off like our discussion on macro. I mean,
Mhm.
that is a big thing, because if you know, example that Optic with Optic playing that spot out of Launchpad, the only reason they were able to play it is because they had this knowledge difference that on top of all the other teams where they knew this was playable and other teams just didn't know it was playable. And so you
Mhm.
could study the map, and maybe 9 times out of 10 it doesn't pay off, but that one time where you know something that somebody else doesn't know can be an absolutely huge advantage. And when and like you put it, where everyone does have a limited amount of time, that absolutely can be a difference maker for you, because not everyone had the time to put into that.
This is actually going to be weirdly specific, but you remember you and I just before this were talking about a ranked game that we played
Yeah.
together where we ended up playing on top of the pillars, and I'd sort of say, you know, like you can actually think about this in that context where yeah, you can rely on your like pattern recognition. You know, for example, that in thermal height is good, that scaffolding is good, that donut building is good if you want to
Right.
play for those end games, but like the only reason that we ended up playing that pillar in the ranked game that you and I were talking about is because I had seen people do it in a pro game. I'd never been in that situation myself and was like,
Right.
oh, you know, let's do this. And so like you can rely on a lot of pattern recognition and then try things out and learn about there's a really good chance that if you play on top of pillar on high ground in a place like that where you don't have a new castle, you get destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying, like
Absolutely.
you have to trial and error, and you have to trial and error with different legends, with different comps, with different timings, with different rings, and each of those times you shouldn't be just categorizing something as this is entirely good or this is entirely bad, but this doesn't work the way that we tried it. What is a way that we can make that work? Is it possible to make that work? What ring would have to happen? What convict, etc.
That's good. And obviously, if you don't have the memory where you're worried that you might not be able to recall that, just write it down. I mean, like I said,
Yeah.
you can download a map from Apex Legends Status, put it on Microsoft Paint, and just put a little red dot and be like,
Meh.
make a little note of it, or number it. Put a little red one and then annotate it on the side and be like, oh, this spot was played. I saw this spot played. That was cool. Could we make it work
Mhm.
with X? And you could do that and build it over time as you're playing ranked or pubs or something. And you just note something and write it down. You don't always have to commit it to memory either. That's a really good way you can do that. So moving into micro and talking a little bit about the micro, how would you describe micro as a learning tool in the game? How would you approach learning micro, and what would you describe as encapsulating micro in Apex?
I think that micro can it covers a lot because
Yeah,
there's a lot of like small things in
right.
Apex. I would largely break it down into what am I doing versus what is my team doing. And then somewhere in this ephemeral area, we have what are other teams doing?
Yeah.
Um, and you can break all of those down even further. To break down what am I doing, I think you can like look at optimizing exactly how much damage you're doing, like learning recoil patterns, how
Right.
to take a 1v1, how to take a 1v2, etc., how to tap strafe. But then when you look at like what is my team doing, you need to be thinking about exactly the angles that you're taking in an area. And this is going to start to encapsulate some of your map knowledge in your macro that we talked about earlier.
Right.
What are angles that we can play, and how can I use those to open up an angle for my team? And then you've got what are other teams doing? And that is also going to be based on your map knowledge, your game
Right.
sense, which is, we've been taking this fight for this long. How's that going to impact other things? And I think you can group all of those into micro, which makes
Yeah.
it a really dense topic, like a lot of
Right.
things in it.
And so we could take this and maybe we move into rather than harping on it as one individual topic, maybe we do break it off and go into the individuals. So let's move instead then into fights specifically and the type of knowledge that you can um study outside of the game to be better at fighting. You mentioned, there's the other aspects of that, like fight tempo. What other aspects encapsulate what you need to know about a fight in Apex?
I think roles are really important. It's going to depend, like, if you're introducing the idea of roles to a pro league team, they probably already understand it. But like to the casual viewer or player, I mean, you were talking earlier about how you're starting to play Fragger for your own group, and like understanding what that means, like and how that fits into the order of operations in an engagement is important. So who is going to be opening things up? Are you starting with an opener? Like, are you the kind of team that actually has somebody that goes in immediately? Or are you basically two anchors and a refragger sitting there going, well, I guess they have to make a mistake,
Right.
which people do. People do
Right.
that in Pro League. I don't think it's great, but they do it in
Yeah.
Pro League.
Yeah.
Uh, and uh, and so like understanding what it is that your team really like provides in terms of their play styles and how you can use that to uh, force errors or bait errors in another team. Um, I think I've gotten a little too general, so I'm gonna let you just sort of guide the
No, and I
conversation.
think
Yeah.
absolutely that's something helpful because, like you said, when talking about roles,
Mhm.
something you can plan because I want to take this in the steps of what you can study and then what you can plan, and those are two different things, right? Obviously, one is just uh, taking in information, and the other is outputting, and
Mhm.
and so from a taking in perspective, study what the different roles are and to kind of talk about like resources here. I mean, obviously just watching the way that teams play and identifying the the way that people engage with the game. There's obviously like an IGL, but that's an um outside of combat role that takes place. But then there's also the fragger, the refrag, there's an anchor, and all of those things are dynamic. But you can definitely look into the roles and how they interact with the game, and then you can finally put that to paper and be like, okay, talk with your team and say, this is what the expectations are for what each person is doing, and that's something that you can do to prepare um, in that perspective. Going into
Mhm.
like specifically other things that you could study about the game at a micro perspective is positioning. I think is a big one,
Mhm.
and you touched on that. What it was like, if I'm playing this space, starting to understand. Well, I need to understand how do I hold opponents, right? And this is something that goes into a little bit more mechanical skills that you can work on, like actual in-game mechanics, and a really good person to send you to another channel that's catching a stray plug is Wraith Crew. Absolutely fantastic coach for all things movement and mechanics. So when we're talking about those things, definitely that's a person that you can approach for that. Um, I'll definitely be trying to bring on people in the future to talk specifically like more mechanics oriented things because that's something I haven't really touched on too much in my content. But that's something that like absolutely from a micro perspective, your positioning, right? I'm trying to hold teams, and we want to hold this position. Where do we need to be to hold
Mhm.
this, right? I think I talked about this a little bit with Balverine, but like if our backs to zone, then I know we can focus on um, you know you're looking this way, you're looking this way, you're looking this way. Maybe it is that cookie cutter. We're in a building, you're looking out this window, I'm looking out the door, he's looking out this window. Sometimes it is that simple. If you're in the center of zone, who do I have to prioritize to make sure I don't get pushed? And a lot of that, I think, and maybe you agree with me, is a lot of this comes down to it is learning specific buildings, and we talk about map knowledge, and it all does kind of come full circle. It's learning how buildings are played, learning how certain positions are played out of, and that comes from like high repetitions of playing it in ranked and seeing what works, what doesn't, playing it in like in scrims, watching it on in pro league, and just studying areas of the map in end zones, right?
Mhm.
How are people who's playing? You mentioned this earlier. Zero, he can identify a god spot and be like, this is who will win the game. And that comes from like they know what positions can be like in that spot. You have to hold a lot easier positions than if you're in a worse place. And then we move into like rotations, right? And micro rotations in endgame are a lot different than like the macro rotations getting to an end zone. Um, Other things for like fights, you mentioned fight tempo. Could you talk a little bit about what fight tempo is and kind of how you would identify uh, how you could study fight tempo?
Yeah, it is a fight tempo is probably one of the most intuitive things in the game because it's the thing that gives people the most dopamine when they're just like play. You load up
Yeah,
the
yeah,
game, you crack somebody, and you're like, "Ooh, I got a chance, let's go!"
yeah.
And that at the very base level is fight tempo. Is like when you have an advantage over somebody else and you can use that. Um, and so that changes at every level of the game because in pubs somebody might have hit you for 25 damage and you look over the rock that you're popping a cell behind and like they're all over you like they're
I was
coming
just gonna say it.
yeah, yeah.
That's my biggest
But
beef with ranked is everyone has bad fight tempo. They hit you for 25 damage. They run across the map to kill you.
yeah, like I mean it happens, right? And then like you can look at how that changes over time based on the squads around you because say if you're in zone 4 and all of a sudden you take 150 damage from somebody, they in ranked, you're probably getting sent. In Pro League, depending on your spot, you're not.
Right.
Because like you may have lost tempo, but you have the luxury of doing that because you're covered
Right.
by other teams. And so tempo is really about who gets the next move, who has an advantage in the moment, and understanding how your comp affects that is also an important part of micro. One of the things that I wanted to touch on when we were like looking at fighting earlier and holding buildings and things like that is how much legends matter, because like
Right.
uh, taking height, for example, like taking a sniper tower is incredible if you're playing an overlook zone.
Right.
But if there's a horizon team running up behind you, who cares? Who actually cares? And like holding a corner, as this happens to me all the time as Rampart, holding a corner in pubs might be a great idea. You've got your ult out, everything looks good, but then you get seer scanned and your ult is canceled, and you're like, well, what? I mean, what do I actually do now? Like,
Right.
thing. I know. Seer scan cancels Rampart ult. Today you learned.
It does. It's so bad. It feels
Yeah.
so bad too. It feels
It
terrible.
it's rough. But like knowing things like that, knowing how legends affect tempo is important. If you crack a conduit, probably doesn't give you that much tempo. And so
Right.
it is more about who gets the next move.
And so I think like because I do think like each individual aspect of micro could probably be parsed out into its own individual interview and discussion.
Yeah.
The last one, so we'll touch on the last one, and then I want to move into legends because I think you made some really good points there that are worth discussing
Okay.
and that are a little more tangible. But you talked a little bit about player psychology. Would you describe that as under micro, or would you put that as its own topic?
I would put that as its own topic. I think it's more closely tied to tempo and maybe a bit of macro.
Okay, so you
Um,
want to touch a little
yeah.
bit on what you would define as player psychology and why that matters to study that as a student of the game?
Yeah, and I think yeah, yes, I would. When you're in ranked, it really like understanding player psychology really just understands to understand like comes down to understanding the ape within us all, right? The
Right.
person who is going to send you and when they're going to do
Yes.
that, how they're going to do that. When you are when it actually becomes super beneficial and not just something that keeps you from feeding face and ranked, is when you are playing at the highest level or close to it in high level challenger circuit or pro league, and you get to look at specific people or specific teams and how they like to play the game. Northampton is a good example. The squad that was Northampton, it like played super conservatively throughout the last, not this most recent land, but split two
Right.
playoffs or champs before that. Um, and the way that they played moving into the next land, actually, Gambare Otosan is a better example because Gambare Otosan got signed
Right.
by a much more aggressive org. And so, like, watching the way that player and team um, play styles, gameplay philosophies
Right.
change over time is really can can give you a better understanding of what they're about to do next, which informs what your best decision is.
Right.
Um, and so to bring this down into a more tangible thing, if I'm playing out of Geyser and I know that there are some psychopaths playing mod, I've got to rotate out of Geyser pretty quickly, or I've got to take control of a mod rotation.
Right.
If I'm playing out of Geyser and I know that my boy over here who chills 5 days a week and he just hits me up and he's like, hey, what's going on? There's no rush, there's no need, I hope you're
Yeah.
living life well. He's probably not psycho rotating into Geyser on me. And so like you need to watch other players VODs, need to watch other teams perspectives, not just to understand like what is available to them, but what kind of people they are. Like are they going to random push you? Because that's what that that's a variable that you need to be taking into consideration.
Right. And adding on to that, this is something I've talked about a lot that um I'm not sure if it's an original thought. I'm sure it's something people have talked about, but it's something I like to mention a lot is cornered snakes is what I call them. In a game, especially like closer to end zone, there are situations where you have teams that are backed into corners, and I call them cornered snakes. because you don't
Hmm.
want to back a snake into a corner because now it has to lash out in some way, right? It has to go somewhere. Uh,
Hmm.
there's only a certain amount of volume in an end zone, and it has to take up some of that volume. And so when you have a team that is in a position where they cannot do anything but lash out, you have
Hmm.
to. That is the riskiest team to your game, and so
Hmm.
you have. That's something that when you're studying the game, you need to learn. Not necessarily like who there aren't cornered snake teams. There are teams that are cornered snakes, and so it's important to understand what the positions are that, and just to simplify it, it's often the team that just has nowhere else to go. A really good example is I was watching Tripods VOD. If you want to go, if anyone is wants to see a specific example, there's a Tripods World's Edge game in my VOD review where they obviously now they're KCP, I think, but Tripods VOD review where they are playing outside of Mirage, and they have a really good position uh, on a rock outside of Mirage and next to the choke that goes into Thermal Station. And there is a team that gets stuck in that choke, and the only way that they can go is through you. Now, they were very fortunate that that team had an evac, but if that team didn't have an evac, the only option that that team could do is to push out of that choke into you. And you get no, obviously you could get easy KP, and that could be a situation where you just got good kills, but the problem is, you're not taking that fight in a vacuum. There's other teams looking at you. You take damage or one player gets knocked, that invites another team to take your position that might be better, or just to clean up or thirst that person. Now you're playing as a duo, and um it's the same situation in endgame. If you're aware that there's 3 squads alive, but for a fact one of them is a ratting solo. Right now, that ratting solo is probably a bigger threat to your game than the trio, because all that rat needs to do is pick you to try to get a knock on, and they one clip one of your teammates, and now you're a 2v3 against the main team that you're worried about. And learning to identify those, I think that does play into the player's psychology, where like understanding when teams have positions that force them to do unfavorable things, especially toward you. That's something you need to be aware of. And you can take advantage of that too. If you know that there's a team that is, in example, like in that thermal choke and has to push out, and you're not the team that's on that height, you could be looking for that as, hey, when this team inevitably pushes out and fights them because they have no other choice, we need to be able to capitalize on that. And those are the types of things that you can learn if you start to understand when teams are forced to make decisions. I think that factors in as well.
Hmm.
Do you have any other thoughts on player psychology as a whole and how you can kind of make plans for that?
Uh, I actually think we've covered it really well. I did
Yeah.
want to add one small thing, as just as a well-known example that because you were talking about quartered snakes and
Yeah.
like teams that you can coexist with versus not, or rather, my brain sort of like jumped into this, but Falcons are a really good example, or Zeros are really good examples in IGL of somebody whose psychology influences the way that the whole team plays the game.
Right.
Um, in the sense that you don't really get to coexist with falcons. Let's say we're playing Skyhook and you're sitting in a building and you have top floor and falcons have bottom floor. Eventually you're like one of you is going to die because falcons simply don't coexist with other teams.
Right.
It's not something that they believe is a good read on the game. And so in that case, if you know that you're rotating into an area that has falcons in it, or better yet, you're able to identify, hey, that building was taken super early. That's probably falcons.
Right.
You can use that to inform what you can expect from the team above you. Take that team, take falcons, replace them with CCE, and you're both chilling for a while.
Right. And
You know.
yeah, and even input. I mean, that's another thing too. Like in the Jumba video with the Trident that won, or the car that won um the tournament, or lost them the tournament. I forget exactly what the name of the title is. But anyway, uh Verhulst noted that there's a double M&K team playing in the red room or whatever. It's just a specific example. But like you can understand like teams might play differently if you're looking for like CC, or looking at CC, or looking at ranked or something. If you can learn to pick up input and like which is easiest identification is like the way that they take the fight with you. But if you can learn like how they're moving, if you see they're moving pretty poorly, maybe it's safe to assume that they're in a controller, which means that your approach to the game could be a little bit different. That's something that's high level, but if you can get good at reading input, Wraith. This is another plug to Wraith. He's getting a lot of free plugs today because he's really good at this stuff. But you do approach fighting different inputs differently, right? There because controller has what he calls, I think, is just like the death zone. And it's just like if you're in this area of controller where aim assist is hard kicked in, it's very unlikely as an MK player that you're going to out aim that person. And so learning how to outplay a controller versus learning how to outplay an MK player, they're totally different. And that's something about play that also factors into player psychology, because those teams are going to also take a fight with you differently. It's the same reason why like APAC North has caught a lot of her critiques for being too passive. And one of the big reasons is because they have a lot of MK players. And so, yes, like there's a very specific example. I forget what team was. They got a knock on Team Liquid now, and they didn't push them, and it was outside of tree. And they're like, why didn't they push that team? So easy push. And it's like, by the time they could get that res off, and the reality is, if they're like forcing a close indoor fight with a triple controller player team, it might be a pretty bad disadvantage, even though they may have an armor diff. They're fighting where in the area where they have the controller players have the biggest advantage, right? And so that factors into player psychology as well, is like understanding how they might change their playstyle based on input. It's not something that I think you need to harp on as big as some of the other factors, but it's something that if you can learn to pick up on can be helpful. Would you agree with that? I think I hopefully grabbed that.
Yeah. I think it's a reasonable point. Yeah.
Yeah, and then just to kind of skim over this one, because it is something I do think is worth studying as a student of the game, and it's one of the things that can benefit you mechanically the most, is studying the weapons themselves, studying the recoil patterns of certain guns. If you want to improve mechanically, understanding how the recoil patterns work, learning things like recoil smoothing. These are things that you can like study outside the game. Obviously, they're going to come into like the actual game a little bit more practically. Like you are going to spend time aim training and stuff like that. But from like just studying the game, you can learn the recoil patterns and learn other tools like that. Is there anything else you would add for like studying the game from a weapons perspective?
I think
I think it's a pretty
just
basic one.
generally, yeah, generally knowing, and you'll get a feel for like through game sense as well. But I think knowing time to kill is really important,
Right.
especially when we're talking about the interaction between weapons and inputs. Um, I think that those
Yeah.
are good things to know. Yeah.
And we'll kind of touch on that a little bit in a second. But the other in the because the last one that I have here, I mean, we have movement, but I think that's something that you practice in game. Just like learning what the movement is, like we're learning what movements are is important. But even at the pro level, they like most people will admit that like having advanced movement beyond like the wall bouncing and the tap strafing isn't going to give you the crazy amount of success that just being better at shooting your gun is going to give you, and your game knowledge is going to give you. The other aspects are going to provide probably more value. Not saying movement's not good, it absolutely is, but it's typically the movement that you don't recognize, and it's not really a topic for here, so we'll just kind of move in. But the last one I want to talk about before is Legends, because we talked about it a little bit, and I think it is something that learning the game as a student is very important, because we've seen a lot of problems where like you could get out you could lose to a team because you just didn't know a legend did something specific. And I've seen it happen. But like one of the things that I noted that Tripods did really well is I was watching their I forget the name of the tournament, the EWC qualifiers, and that's the VOD review I did for them when they won EWC finals. And one of the things they noted is they had watched they know the teams that were playing, and they knew that one of the teams was Meat Lovers, and they were playing in a tunnel outside of Overlook, the tunnel from Overlook, like the top tunnel from Overlook that goes into Geyser, but before it drops down the elevator. They're playing up there, and Anmu knew that there was a specific spot that Alter could queue through to go from the bottom tunnel all the way up to their choke. And it's like something that you only know, it comes back to map knowledge, but also like because the character's so new, it's kind of crazy that he even knew that. But that could have been the death of their team. If they had, suddenly a whole 3 stack with Alter crypto altar, they get crypto alted up there, and an altar comes through the wall in between the team. That could have been the end of them, and it didn't end up coming to fruition. But that's something where like understanding and learning about the individual legends can be so valuable, because you can learn advantages that you'd never even think about. Like another one is, for example, is the current Fuse exploit that's happening right now. Whether or not it's an exploit, whole different discussion. But right now, the ability
Fuse
to
feature.
Fuse feature, the ability to hit Fuse ult has been something that for a long time they're like, hey, you should shoot the highest thing that you can see, because it's going to make the radius of the ultimate bigger, which means that you get a larger player scan for that. Everyone in the radius you could see. And so it's been a thing for about a year where you'd pop an evac, and then you would hit a Fuse ult on the evac, and it would create this huge radius, and you could see a lot of stuff. The damage radius is large as well. And it's something that comes with just knowing the character. And for a long time, no one even really thought about it. No one really did it, and it was a very niche thing that like some people, like the one Fuse crutch in ranked would pull off, and everyone was like, why would I even use an evac for that? And now it's something that's being used widely in competitive, and this is something that like Tech gets a lot of credit for. Is like Tech pioneers a lot of things like this. He likes to push the meta. There are a few other people that also like to do that, but overall, like you can get a lot of advantage from knowing legends better than other people. And that's something that can allow you to shine and pull out really like amazing things that can catch people off guard. But what other aspects of learning the legend would you say learning legends would you say is important for people to focus on when they're trying to improve their game?
Well, I think that the most important one is like how a legend can impact the tempo of a fight. Um, and when a legend makes ground holdable versus not, which is in a similar
Ooh, I
vein.
like that one.
When we were talking about Horizon earlier, I mean, obviously, Rampart Newcastle fan here, like, very similar thing. Um, Ash is important for, like, when you can get to a space in the same way as Horizoners, or in a very similar way. And so I think, like, it's important to understand not only the tools that are available to you, but what you're fighting up against. Yesterday, I'm still crying about it, but like I'm sitting there on Broken Moon, and I Kraber a Bloodhound in the face, and I'm like, that's it. We win this game. Let's go. And we all
Easy.
walk across this field to get to Bloodhound, but they've got a lifeline, and so like I never saw Lifeline, don't know where she came from, but all of a sudden it's a 3v3 and now we're on low ground. And so understanding how like legends can impact tempo is really important, because even if we had we known that there's a Lifeline on that team, it's a very different fight.
Right.
It's not even it's not even nearly over. We need to nade, we need to get high ground on it, we need to finish blood. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
legends can totally change your order of operations, and that's just one legend and one example.
Yeah, I mean Conduit's another one that at the beginning of season 20, I believe, was like mid split one. That was someone that a lot of people were like, hold up on Conduit, because now the entire tempo of a fight's changed. Instead of people having to pop
Mhm.
batteries when they get cracked and I can push on it, they hit a Conduit queue and they're back in the fight right away. And I still argue that Conduit I think is actually still pretty good. But
Mhm.
I mean there Conduit, Lifeline, they're both really good examples. And there's a lot of other ones like understanding what area is playable is a really big aspect too, because with controller legends, right? You almost always need one in comp, I would say. I mean, there's some teams that don't, right? If you're playing like
Some
Edge or
teams
something,
are infused.
right? And some teams run Fuse, and now you have like the Fuse, you have Vantage, you have the Pathfinder that can now all three hit ring console. Um, I think NRG actually ran Pathfinder last split or last match day. I don't know if that was a troll or not. I know they've always wanted Pathfinder to be meta, or like I don't know. I've seen them try to force it in the past. That's neither here nor there. But like understanding what legends can do for you is a big value, but also what's playable. Like one big thing I've always said is like I'll hear people play Watson, and they'll be like, "We're playing Watson. We have to find a good building to sit in." And I'll hear that in ranked, and I'm always like, this is a peeve of mine. Is like I genuinely believe Watson's largest value is outside of buildings. I think actually Watson is the best of all the controller legends for holding outside space comparatively
Yes.
to, and whereas like a Caustic is a lot better at holding inside space, because as soon as you go in that room, you can't do anything, you can't see anything. It's great. Catalyst is good at holding the doors and punishing you for trying to push, keeping you out. But like Caustic is a little bit better of like once you're in there, you're hurting. And so those two teams players are way better. But like if you don't understand, the inherent value a legend gives you, then you're not setting yourself up for success. And I think that's a big area of knowledge difference between pro players and even CC players is not understanding what the actual value is of a legend. One big thing was during the last age of Horizon. One of the big things that people were talking about was like, oh, well, obviously Horizon's biggest value is the ability to rotate their team to height for fights. And that absolutely is a value that Horizon gave. But at the end of her life cycle, she was moving so slow that any pro player could beam you off the tower. That no longer was what the biggest benefit was. The biggest benefit was, as Raven put it, it's basically a better Watson ult because you can, I'm about to get hit with a Bangalore ultimate. I'm about to get hit with XY, like nades, whatever. I'm just going to take the Horizon lift. And then I negated all of that. And now I'm closer to you than I was before. And that's something that a lot of people underestimated. I mean, and then you talk about like Alter with Tech, and what he saw as the true capability was not like, I can just I can just go through walls, right? It's like, I can use it to have an aggressive push with a crypto, right? I look at a synergy there. I can make an aggressive push with the crypto and not get stunned by the crypto ult because we time it right and we move in. We're in our invulnerability frames when the crypto ult goes off, and I think that's a big part of studying the game that can really make a difference for you, is understanding the true benefits that a legend gives you. And then I touched a little bit on it, but like the synergies that can work with other legends. Bang Blood is the most obvious of them, but there's a lot of them. And is there anything that I really missed that I think you'd want to touch on in terms of like studying legends and how you can prepare for the game by studying them
No,
specifically?
I think we've covered a lot of it. It's just like understanding cases where you can get value out of it. We did talk about the POI thing as well and how like they interact with your POI legends that like Watson or like Conduit that provide you a little bit more econ. Loba is a great
Right.
example as well. Can sort of like shore up weaknesses of a POI. So maybe not just how they interact with other legends, but how they interact with the literal terrain and pathing that you have available to you.
Right, like CCE, they were talking about how Command Center they play Valk because they
Yeah.
could choose to not do that, but then their being able to get prio to zones was dependent on finding an evac tower, and that just wasn't as
Yeah.
feasible for them. And so yeah, there's a lot of different variation. I think that's something where if you're looking at trying a legend, definitely watch players that are succeeding with it in comp to replicate that first. The last little touch of specific things you can learn is game updates, and this is one that I actually think is the most underutilized because especially in the pro league scene, there's a very big hesitation to adapt new playstyles unless they're widely adopted. Is something I've noticed in the past. Lifeline was getting a lot of hate till Aurora showed out, which love that team, man. I love that team. But there's always hesitancy, but ultimately, the game updates, patch notes, stuff like that completely changes the flow of the game. And I don't think there's a ton more to say other than every time there's patch notes, you need to be looking at them and thinking about them in the broader applications of the game. And if you become very capable of reading those correctly, it can put you at a big advantage in ranked, in CC, in comp. Because if you're able to identify advantages in those patch notes, and sometimes they're simple as like the Havoc's not good anymore or something, and I need to pick up the next best gun, or maybe that'll come soon, hopefully. Fingers crossed. But maybe you like, or something like that, or maybe you see, okay, something as simple as like Cat can't throw her tactical as far, or Fuse getting ring console as one of his perks, and there's being able to see those and interpret them correctly is a value that's very high in competitive all the way down to the bottom levels for being able to succeed. What else do you think is important for game updates? Do you think there's anything else that people need to be looking for? Would you put as much stake as maybe I'm putting into them, or do you think that maybe they're a little bit less valuable than I'm hyping them up to be?
I think it's part of the what you talked about earlier, like the valuable quality of being a student of the game is once you start understanding things, once you're able to like observe them in other people and other teams, is being able to take things like game updates and then experiment with them yourself or think about edge cases. A really good example would be when Evo caches were introduced and we moved to the new system of evolving armor. um, Teams that were like, okay, great, you know, we've got to fight a few people, but more or less things are going to be even, versus teams that got in a trident at the start of the game, hit a million Evo caches, and were on red without fighting anyone. That's a massive advantage. Um,
Bruh, yeah.
and it has nothing to do with the game at all before that. It's not something that you would have really intuited. You would have gone, well, this actually looks like something that we can take advantage of. That's part of the natural game system that improves our consistency. And a lot of things in patch notes are balanced around how consistent they're going to be. And so, just like I would say, looking at patch notes is important, of course, but getting creative with patch notes and like applying that to all of the other things that we've talked about today is sort of the most important step of that. Reading it is nice. It's more of a creative exercise when you're first looking at patch notes, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's to kind of sum that up. I mean, we talked about, I think Jayhawk and I forget exactly who I was talking with. We were talking about how like Optic, like X Optic,
Mhm.
now Skid, they, they struggled in the beginning because they didn't have a coach, and this is a good transition to my next and one of my last questions here. But
Mm.
you know, the they when the Evo changes happened, they weren't studying the patch notes as much, and a lot of that came from like their timing that they had available to them, because obviously in Pro League there's a lot more that factors into your time. But they would pass Evo caches on a trident,
Mhm.
and you'd be like, well, if they gone 50 feet to the left, had someone hop off, they could grab that, and that was more important than the timing, and that was a something that they just had not adapted to from the patch notes. You have the same where like a legend will get nerfed, and a team will one team will realize that that was enough to stop playing that legend, and other people will not realize that, and then now they're like, well, why am I losing my fights, and why am I having this disadvantage? Whereas they realized that like Lifeline's buff, and they were and Aurora was like, I realized that this is enough of a buff to Lifeline to make her viable in comp.
Mhm.
And Seer, some like even like I noticed that Seer is more viable than people give credit for, because I noticed that like these little patches and changes, and I think that's something that just like we said before, studying the game and studying the other aspects we've talked about will allow you to recognize those benefits in patch notes, and experimenting and creative is where you're going to see that shine. But one of the biggest issues, and one of the reasons that pro teams are a little bit slower to adapt those, is because being a pro player takes a lot of time, and most of that time is spent scrimming and VOD reviewing, practicing the actual game, because you need to keep up your mechanics, you need to keep up your in-game synergy. There's a lot of other facets, and so often the person that will fill that gap is a coach. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because with all this heavy information that a pro league caliber team has to absorb, in your opinion, like what role does a coach play in interacting with that information?
I think the largest part of it is getting to do a lot of the creative work that we mentioned with like reading patch notes, because a player's job at its simplest level is just to win, and so you're going to
Right.
go with the safest bet and the thing that you know the best. And a coach's job, and it does vary in Apex Legends especially, but I would argue that a coach's job, or perhaps an analyst's job, is to look at things that you're not optimizing and get creative with what other teams aren't doing. And so, not just sort of like as a player looking internally, how can we win this game? How can we win this match set? But as a coach, going, what are other teams not doing that we can be doing? How can we get ahead? How, like we talked about, like a player probably isn't going to just land in. Most players aren't going to land in customs and go, all right, well, I landed landslide. Here's my loop path. How quick can I get to grandma's house versus
Right.
countdown. Okay, now countdown. How quick can I get to grandma's house? They're just not going to do that because they're worried about how they shoot, how they aim, like you said, how they work with their teammates. Those are big, big factors.
Right.
And so a coach's job is to look at things like those timings, how far you can get from your POI, how quickly, what micro interactions you might have, what are other tactics or rotations the teams are doing that let you get small advantages and put your players in a better place to succeed.
I like that. I don't really have anything else to add because I feel like you perfectly encapsulated that. I would definitely thank you. So, but I would touch the last question I really think I have
Mhm,
on specific roles and stuff like that is statistics because you touched on it that analysts can play a role in this. And at
mhm,
this point, we've talked about a lot of ways you can learn and prepare for the game. But one thing we haven't really touched too much on is the role that the stats specifically play. Because in this game at a higher level, when we're learning which POI to play, which ways to rotate, what areas have the best weapons, what the best weapons are. This info is all informed some way by metrics. And how valuable would you say that stats are to the work that you do, both as like a caster learning the game, and how valuable would you say these stats are to the players at the highest level, and who puts that all together?
I think that they're valuable to the players, but by a few degrees. Like for me, stats are very valuable in a way that they'll never be useful to players because it's a good way for me to give the audience a good idea of what's happening, and then
Right.
players just don't care.
Yeah.
But I think that they're useful to the players by a few degrees of separation, where statistics can point to things that you might not otherwise be able to put words to, and sort of focus your curiosity.
Right.
I think a particularly relevant example of this is with POI draft. Trident is a terrible POI in theory. It
In
has
theory.
very little. But when you look at like the average points for teams that are coming out of Trident, how often they're getting top 3 and things like that, it's not a god POI, but it's a lot better than people would have given it credit for. And so that's those statistics, the average points coming out of Trident, what teams are succeeding coming out of a POI like Trident should be and can, or I guess can and should be, piquing your curiosity as a coach or as a player about the game and going, huh, what's going on here? If you look at a player's damage differential, what if it's really high? It doesn't mean that they're just better than everyone else. Don't look at it like that. Look at it like, what are they doing that I'm not doing, that my team isn't doing? How can we maximize this? What does it mean about their playstyle? Stats focus your brain.
And that's I really really like that, and it made me think of a specific example. But when you're learning the game,
Mm-hmm.
you can only we've talked to this a couple times. You only have so much time in a day, and if you're not doing this full time, you have even less, right? And so if you're trying to study the game to improve, you can only put your time into a few things, and when you're studying. And I really like that you said stats focus your brain, because if you are trying to figure out what's valuable, stats can highlight some of those things. Like one of the biggest examples that I remember is I've been inputting the POI draft stats, right? And one of the things that I noticed while I was doing it is I was inputting the info for EMEA, right, for Europe, and I'm putting in the info, and I'm like, okay, I forget exactly what the number is, but I was like, okay, Trident POI, it was like eighth draft pick, and I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean Trident was picked eighth? One of the
Mm-hmm.
worst POIs on both maps, and it was typically 40th, 39th. It got picked to eighth. And so I looked and I was like, it's Alliance. And then I was like, okay, well, why is Alliance doing that? And then I realized that what they had revealed is they had basically mimicked what '07 was doing at Lava Siphon, where they were saying, okay, we're going to land at Trident, and if you land on North Pad, we're going to ride that Trident over to you, and we're going to kill you because this is
Mm-hmm.
our POI now. And if you don't land there, great, we get both. And now we'll take one of us will take the Trident over there, they'll loot it all over there, and then we'll meet up. And basically, they revealed a strategy that I would have just probably like if you're not don't have the time of the day to watch every region and or all the scrims and stuff, then like you wouldn't notice that. But you could just look at statistics and you'd be like, oh wait, this is something new. Let me investigate that. And now you just discovered potentially a way to lock down North Pat that you didn't think about. And if you're a coach in North America, you're coaching APAC North or something, you have a team that really likes that place, you were like, now this is a new strategy we can consider that you didn't think about before, that stats kind of opened up for you. Or, you know, you mentioned before time to kill and weapons, and you'd be like, well, actually, this time to kill is lower than I thought. Why is everyone playing this? And then you realize, well, you know, for the Havoc, it's played because it has a ridiculous mag size and it can put out more damage. And maybe the time to kill isn't as high as a different gun, but it has a longer mag, which means that it can one clip 2 people with 1 mag, which is insane. But yeah, I mean, the statistics can highlight things like that and make you raise questions that prompt you to learn more. And especially, like you said, the POI draft's a big example of where stats can really help you. And I've said this before, you know, if you're at a lower level, the POI draft does kind of replicate some things in like ranked and in comp and CC, and you can take little elements of that and be like, well, you know, suddenly I'm seeing everyone play out of coastal camp, and why after the first 2 weekends it was like the top 5 best POI despite being like one of the lowest drafts, and you're like, maybe there's something there, maybe it means something, maybe it means Falcons landed there and just got a crazy amount of points because they're built different, but it could mean like could mean something else, and so it prompts you, right? I mean, yeah.
It's just that it's the like what it could be something. Let me think about it. Let me
Exactly.
compare it with my other experiences. Let me do some research. It's the creative
Right.
spark.
And so I think that hopefully we've given everyone a outline of the types of things that you can be learning about the game to improve it, and the types of ways you can prep going into the game, because a lot of this is like, you know, take notes, you know, build spreadsheets, build maps, like do things that are going to help you succeed that you can reference back to be successful, and ultimately just be a student of the game, because it's going to help a lot. But to conclude here today, what do you feel like is the biggest takeaway that someone looking to improve outside of the game can take from this? Someone that's trying to look what they can do when they're not playing to improve. What do you feel like is the biggest takeaway that will help them approach this in a way that's achievable?
Uh, the biggest note would be know what level you're playing at, because of that scale that we talked about, where as you go up the scale to world championships, you can assume more about the game, you can assume more about your opponents, know exactly what you can assume and what you can't, and where you cannot assume, uh, this is my personal philosophy, where you cannot assume what a team is going to do your best to make their choice for them. Do your best to make choices for other teams by putting yourself in a good position, by picking legends that counter theirs, by landing on high ground, by doing whatever you can. If you take that as a base and go, what do I know? What can I control? And try and maximize both of those things at any given time, you're going to have a much better success rate. Other than that, I think curiosity.
I like that a lot. I have no notes, so I just want to say thank you again, Dia, for coming on. This has been an awesome interview, and I think that a lot of people will be able to take something away from this that can hopefully help them improve their game. But in the meantime, where can people find you? Is there any projects you're working on aside from just being on the main broadcast that we can watch you there and support you there? But is there anywhere else we can support you, find you?
I mean, engaging with me on Twitter is always super useful. I'm esports underscore Dia. I am maybe putting out a few. I mean, you saw one of my YouTube videos, I'm sure, but like I'm maybe putting out a few of those. You should be able to find that linked through Twitter. Mostly Twitter, honestly. I talk
Great.
about everything
And
I'm
I'll
doing
link those
there.
both in
And
the description so they can find you there. And then
yeah, yeah, yeah.
sweet. So thank you so much again for coming on. Guys, if you're looking to follow me as well, Twitter at Burke the Nerd as well, and twitch.tv/Burke the Nerd, which I am doing streaming weekly VOD reviews. And I'm actually going to, in this coming week, as this video is releasing, I'm going to be doing 2 different VOD reviews of people that have reached out to me in the community. So if you want to reach out to me about VOD reviewing your specific content as well, you can let me know by reaching out to me on Twitter in DMs, or you can at me there on Twitter or Discord, wherever. And then also make sure, if you haven't already, like and subscribe here and comment ideas for future topics for videos in the future that can help you. Anyway, that's been me. That's been Dia. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.